So we take up the story of the man of God in the 1st of Kings chapter 13, and you'll remember that we left that man in our previous study sitting at the table of the old prophet in deep conversation, when it said in the 1st of Kings chapter 13 and verse 19, he went back with him and did eat bread in his house and drank water. And so he's gone back there, you see, and they're dining together in Bethel. And it may well have been that their discussions were both meaningful and earnest. They may have been conversing on things divine. But the reality was that this meeting should not have taken place at all. One man had lied, the other man had disobeyed. They shouldn't be at this meal, should they? And yet I think even now, brothers and sisters, even at this moment, neither of these two players in the drama really had any inkling as to what was about to befall them in the providence of God. And it was going to come, verse 20, it came to pass as they sat at the table. It was all going to unfold at this precise moment of time, and neither of them were aware at how dramatically circumstances were going to alter from the conversation of their meal at the table. Actually, see that word table in 1st of Kings 13, verse 20? Seems quite a natural thing to say, but I suspect that even that word's a little clue as to part of what's going on here. Because, do you know, in the scripture, tables were usually associated with wealth. We're told that Saul had a table in the 1st of Samuel chapter 20, verse 29. We're told that, well, let's have a look at it. In 2nd of Samuel chapter 9, we're told that David had a table. And it says this concerning David's table, 2nd of Samuel chapter 9, and verse 10. It says, Thou therefore and thy sons and thy servants shall till the land for him, and shall bring in the fruits, that thy master's son may have food to eat. But Mephibosheth, thy master's son, shall eat bread always at my table, says David. The table of David, 2nd of Samuel chapter 9, verse 7 and verse 10. We're told that Solomon had a table in the 1st of Kings chapter 4, verse 27, chapter 10, verse 5. We're told that Jezebel had a table in the 1st of Kings chapter 18, verse 19. We're told that Nehemiah, as the governor, had a table in Nehemiah chapter 5, verse 17. You know that tables are almost invariably associated with the principle of wealth. On the table there was more than enough for the company that gathered. Well, this old prophet's got his own table. And we also know that that old prophet's got an ass. But you see, the ass similarly was an indication of status. You might remember in the book of Judges there was a particular judge, famous in this respect for not only the number of sons that he had, but as the record says in Judges 10 verse 4 of Jair the Gileadite, that he had 30 sons that rode on 30 ass colts, says Judges 10 verse 4. Oh yes, this was a family of considerable status. They all rode on asses, it says. And don't you remember in the 1st of Kings chapter 1 verse 33, when the crisis arises about the coronation of the king to follow David, that David sends a message urgently to say, you must take my royal ass and allow Solomon to ride upon it, so that the matter of his succession is made clear. Give him my royal ass, the mule of David. And you'll remember a certain prophet that says, Behold, thy king cometh unto thee, riding upon an ass, Zechariah chapter 9, verse 9. So the table is a sign of wealth, and the ass is an indication of status. And now we wonder whether the status of the old prophet perhaps affected the decision of the man of God to return with him. Was it because a man of wealth and importance had invited him? Was there respect of persons on the part of the man of God? Perhaps this invitation, brothers and sisters, from a man of substance and significance who wanted to hear more of his thoughts, who admired his courage and what the man of God had done, gave at last to the man of God the recognition he wanted. At last there was someone who recognized the value of his contribution. Why else had he been lingering around the outskirts of Bethel when he was supposed to have gone home? It's true enough in all our lives, isn't it, brothers and sisters? We just want someone to recognize the value of what we've done. And when this invitation came, because it was his weakness, and opportunity arrived, the man of God sinned. And now they're sitting at the table, verse 20, and the record says, the word of Yahweh came unto the prophet that brought him back. So the word came during the very meal they were eating together. But what's surprising is that the word of God didn't come to the man of God. The word of God came to the old prophet. The old prophet that had brought him back. So what a paradox is this, brothers and sisters, that the very man, the old prophet who'd been the instrument of the man of God's sin, now becomes the instrument for the man of God's judgment for that very sin. And the word of God, it says, came unto the prophet that brought him back. And so the record says in 1 Kings 13 verse 21, it says, and he cried unto the man of God that came from Judah. You see that word cried, brothers and sisters? That's the same word in verse 2 when it says that when the man of God came out of Judah to Bethel, that he cried against the altar, verse 2. Same word. So just as the man of God had cried judgment against Jeroboam, so now the old prophet cries judgment against the man of God. It was like a complete reversal of circumstances. The man of God's arrived to cry judgment, and now he has judgment cried against him. You see, this is what happens, brothers and sisters, when we follow the pathway of sin. Everything in life gets turned upside down, terribly turned upside down when sin comes into our lives. And the record says that what the old prophet said, and on behalf of God, because the word of God had come to him, verse 21, the old prophet said, thus saith Yahweh, forasmuch as thou hast disobeyed the mouth of Yahweh, and hast not kept the commandment which Yahweh thy God commanded thee. You see, he disobeyed the mouth of God. The ground of his judgment lay in the fact that his charge had been given to him by the direct revelation of God. It had come from the mouth of the Lord. See, that could never be revoked or superseded by the words of merely another man. And so the man of God will be judged, because that which he had received directly from the mouth of God, he had refused, he had disobeyed. And not only had he disobeyed the mouth of God, but, says the verse, thou hast as a result not kept the commandments which Yahweh thy God commanded thee. And here's the very nub of the matter, brothers and sisters, because you see, here's the problem. That spirit of not keeping the divine commandment was the very sin of Jeroboam. The ground of condemnation for Jeroboam was that he was a man that didn't keep God's commandments. In fact, if you come to the 2nd Kings chapter 17, we looked at this in our exhortation on Sunday, but just a few verses before, the record will say this about the real spirit and influence of Jeroboam upon the northern kingdom. 2 Kings chapter 17, and reading from verse 14 to 16, it says, notwithstanding they would not hear, but hardened their necks like to the neck of their fathers that did not believe in Yahweh their God. And they rejected his statutes and his covenant that he made with their fathers and his testimonies which he testified against them. And they followed vanity and became vain and went after the heathen that were round about them, concerning whom Yahweh had charged them that they should not do like them. And They left all the commandments of Yahweh their God and made them molten images, even 2 calves. Who made molten images, even 2 calves, brothers and sisters? That's Jeroboam, the son of Nebat. He left all the commandments of God, verse 16, in doing so. But now we're told, back in the 1st of Kings, chapter 13 and verse 21, that's what the man of God has done. The man of God has not kept the commandment which Yahweh thy God commanded thee. So you see, the very fact that the man of God had committed the same sin as Jeroboam became the ground for the severity of God's judgment against him. We wonder, don't we, why was the judgment so severe upon the man of God for what seems in a sense like a rather little mistake? Well, because it was the same sin as the very one he'd come to rebuke, you see. It was vital that Jeroboam be witness to the fact that God would not tolerate departure from his commandments. If the man of God could depart from God's commandments but be spared, then why should the king change? You see the conundrum, brothers and sisters? What force would there be to the man of God's words if he himself could ignore Yahweh's commandments without any consequences? If judgment did not occur, then the warning of the man of God was empty and without power. God had to deal with this in order that the judgments that he'd cried against Jeroboam might be seen to be just as grave and just as serious, you see. And perhaps there's a lesson here. It's a lesson that's been fundamental to God's dealings with men and women down through time, brothers and sisters. It's a very simple one, but it's one that we do forget. And it's about the importance of obedience. You see, the man of God was given a specific charge, but he failed to render obedience to the mouth of God, despite the unequivocal clarity of that demand which had been made upon him by his God. All God required was obedience, but God does require that of all his children he ever has. It's the basis of God manifestation, that we live in accordance. We live in obedience to the divine principles. Do you remember this concerning Abraham in Genesis 22 verses 17 and 18? We're told that Abraham was given a final promise confirmed by the oath of God. He was told that he would bring blessing upon all nations, but that blessing would come about because of his obedience. In fact, this is what Genesis says: "In blessing I will bless thee, and multiplying I will multiply thy seed as the stars of the heaven, as the sand which is upon the seashore. Thy seed shall possess the gate of his enemies, and in thy seed shall all nations of the earth be blessed, because thou hast obeyed my voice," says God in Genesis chapter 22. You see, that's ever been the basis of God's dealings with mankind. And if Abraham is adjudged worthy because of that principle of simple, heartfelt, unquestioned obedience to the divine things, then isn't that the ground for the judgment that came upon Saul by way of reverse in the 1st of Samuel chapter 15? Verses 22 and 23, Saul was rejected, was he not, because he would not keep the divine commandment. He would not render obedience. Do you remember Samuel's words? "Hath Yahweh as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of Yahweh? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice." Well, such a simple thing, brothers and sisters. It's only us that make life complicated. God says thus and so and asks us only that we obey, but somehow we've got every reason under the sun why we might not obey, or not just yet, or not just in quite that way. And here's another interesting example. You'll remember in Jeremiah chapter 35, the remarkable story of the house of Rechab, when Jeremiah invites the family to come into the temple area and he offers them wine to drink, knowing full well that it was one of the principles of that family that they would not do so. And you'll remember that what they said to Jeremiah was, well, no, we can't do that. We will not drink wine because we've obeyed the voice of Jonadab, the son of Rechab, our father, in all that he's charged us, to drink no wine all our days, nor to build houses to dwell in. Neither have we vineyard, nor field, nor seed, but we've dwelt in our tents and have obeyed. And God commends the house of Rechab to the nation of Israel. He says, look at this family. Look at what they've done. In fact, he promises, he says, I say, saith Yahweh of hosts, the God of Israel, Jonadab, the son of Rechab, shall not want a man to stand before me forever, because they've obeyed the commandment of Jonadab their father. That's what you should be like, says God. It's that principle of obedience to God's commandments. I think it's true, brothers and sisters, that a generation or two ago, that principle of simple obedience was much more deeply embedded in the thinking and behavior of everyone, and most certainly of those in the household of God. Now we live in a world where the matter of obedience is a matter of personal choice as to whether we might obey or not obey, or do or not do. Because religion is a matter of personal preference, and the trouble is that the moment that arrives in the ecclesia, brothers and sisters, we have all sorts of difficulties, don't we? Obedience, the importance of obedience. It's a divine principle, and here's the lesson, brothers and sisters, I think. If obedience is the prerequisite for divine blessing, then let us never forget that disobedience is the precursor to divine judgment. It's how God works. Don't ever let us think that his principles will change. So the old prophet says to the man of God, verse 22, he says, not only did you not keep the commandment of God, but you came back and hast eaten bread and drunk water in the place of the which Yahweh did say to thee, eat no bread and drink no water. Do you know the words eat and drink are used 7 times in this chapter? Eat and drink, eat and drink, eat and drink, 7 times. This is the last time. This is the final time. And to the Jew, of course, to eat and to drink was an act of fellowship. The real reason for this prohibition upon the man of God was because he represented God. This was God's warning to Jeroboam that he was out of fellowship with heaven. For the man of God to then go and eat and drink in that place was to absolutely ignore that which he represented on behalf of God on this occasion. He was absolutely at variance with the charge that had been given to him. And so the old prophet says that because of what you've done, and because of how you've behaved, at the end of the verse it says, thy carcass shall not come unto the sepulchre of thy fathers. So now comes the detail of God's judgment upon the man of God. I think there are 2 different matters, incidentally, implicit in this curse. I think there's 2 different ideas in that phrase. Thy carcass shall not come unto the sepulchre of thy fathers. I think the first idea was relating to the matter of a possible unburied body. Because you see, an unburied body was considered a body, well, it was considered a matter of disgrace. If you come back to Genesis chapter 23, you will recall at the time of the death of Sarah, these words from Abraham when requesting to purchase a site, which turned out to be the cave of Machpelah. But Abraham puts it this way in Genesis 23, verses 3 and 4. He says, and Abraham stood up before his dead and spake unto the sons of Heth, saying, I am a stranger and a sojourner with you. Give me a possession of a burying place with you, that I may bury my dead out of my sight. You couldn't leave a body unburied. That was a humiliation to that body. Please allow me to purchase a piece of land, says Abraham, that I might give my wife the dignity of that proper interment that she ought to receive. I need to purchase a burying place that might be so. If you come to the 2nd of Kings, chapter 9, you'll remember these words also in what was vouchsafed concerning the impending death of a certain famous woman. In the 2nd of Kings chapter 9 and verse 10, we're told that one of the sons of the prophets came and pronounced this judgment. Verse 10, 2 Kings 9, "The dogs shall eat Jezebel in the portion of Jezreel, and there shall be none to bury her." And he opened the door and fled. He got out as quick as he could, having given that message. But see how the record unfolds at the end of the chapter. Verse 34, 2 Kings 9. "Jehu, when he was come in, he did eat and drink, and said, Go, see now this cursed woman, and bury her, for she is a king's daughter." See that idea? She is a king's daughter. We can't leave her unburied. And they went to bury her, but they found no more of her than the skull and the feet and the palms of her hands. Wherefore they came again and told him. And he said, "This is the word of Yahweh, which he spake by his servant Elijah the Tishbite, saying, In the portion of Jezreel shall dogs eat the flesh of Jezebel, and the carcass of Jezebel shall be as dung upon the face of the field in the portion of Jezreel." In other words, she would die in disgrace, brothers and sisters, because she would die unburied. One further reference, which I'll just quote to you, but you don't need to turn it up, but in Jeremiah chapter 16 and verse 4, the record says something similar. It says, "They shall die of grievous deaths. They shall not be lamented, neither shall they be buried, but they shall be as dung upon the face of the earth, and they shall be consumed by the sword and the famine, and their carcasses shall be meat for the fowls of heaven and for the beasts of the earth." To be left unburied was a disgrace, brothers and sisters, and that's part of the possible judgment that comes against the man of God. But it wasn't just that he might be unburied, it was also, as the old prophet had said, that thy carcass shall not come unto the sepulchre of thy fathers. And likewise, for a body to be buried apart from the family was considered a tragedy. If you come back to the 2nd of Samuel, chapter 19, here's the words of that old man Barzillai, the Gileadite, and he puts it this way, 2 Samuel 19, verse 37. He says, "Let thy servant, I pray thee, turn back again, that I may die in mine own city, and be buried by the grave of my father and of my mother," he says. "That I might die in my own city and be buried by the grave of my father and mother." You see, that was an honourable burial. Buried at the place of the family sepulchre, you see. In fact, 2 further pages, 2nd of Samuel chapter 21, at the end of the story, that intriguing story of the vigil of Rizpah, we're told that David does this, and I think partly in understanding of what Rizpah had done. It says in 2 Samuel 21 verse 12, David went and took up the bones of Saul and the bones of Jonathan, and he brought up from thence, verse 13, those bones, Saul and the bones of Jonathan his son. They gather the bones of these that are hanged in this very chapter. And the bones of Saul and of Jonathan his son buried they in the country of Benjamin, in Zelah, in the sepulchre of Kish his father. And they performed all that the king commanded. And after that decent and honourable burial, God was entreated for the land, and David's final salute of affection for Jonathan his friend is that he took the bones of Saul and Jonathan and buried them in the family sepulchre where they really ought to be, you see. So come back now to the 1st of Kings and chapter 13. And this is obviously the burden of the judgment that the old prophet pronounces against the man of God. That firstly, he might die a death that would leave him unburied, and that secondly, he might die a death in which he would never be buried with his family in the family sepulchre. Oh, this judgment of the 1st of Kings 13, verse 22, concerns both an untimely death and an ignominious disposal. But what the old prophet didn't say, and what the old prophet didn't know, was what the means of death would be, and when exactly that death would occur. See, that was still left undisclosed. I don't think even the old prophet knew. Now just stop for a moment, brothers and sisters, and in the context of our late evening session last night with Brother Ken, picture the scene. Imagine the moment. How did the old prophet feel when this inspired word of judgment came upon him? He would have been astonished and amazed at the experience. If he had been part of the school of the prophets years and years before, then it was probably many, many years since a prophetic utterance had been given him, and now, long after his faith has declined from that earlier zeal he had, he suddenly feels the Spirit of God upon him again. He must have been astonished by that surge of the Spirit speaking through him. But beyond his astonishment, brothers and sisters, he must have felt a terrible guilt that his own lying, his own deception had brought about this shocking consequence upon the man of God, that this judgment was to be pronounced. And if his principal objective was to be stimulated by scriptural conversation, then this outcome must have been devastating in its impact on the old prophet. He'd been living a life of disobedience to the divine commandments himself. How could he pronounce judgment against the man of God and not believe that he also ought to be subject to the same judgment in his own life? And don't you think he would have been excruciatingly aware that his actions had caused another to sin? And you see, I think God spoke through him for the very purpose of touching the heart of the old prophet, that he might change. So verse 23 says, came to pass, after he'd eaten bread and after he'd drunk, he saddled from the ass to wit for the prophet whom he'd brought back. So what we're told in verse 23 is that the meal was concluded before the man of God even left. But the joy of the meal was gone now, wasn't there? Now there's fear and unease. Now there's a shadow hanging over the table as that meal was finished. And yet I still think, brothers and sisters, I think we have this overwhelming impression from verse 23 that despite the unease at the table, that neither of them, even now, are aware of just how swiftly the judgment would fall. I think the man of God rides away in ignorance that his end is actually imminent. He might have thought, well, I'm going to be judged at some point, but not now, not right now, not today. Well, yes, it was, but he didn't know. He rode off in ignorance of how swiftly the matters would be brought to pass. Now, incidentally, when it says in that verse, at the end of the verse, he saddled for him the ass to wit for the prophet whom he'd brought back, I think that the New International Version probably provides the better translation when it says this, and I'll give you the reason for it. The New International Version says, when the man of God had finished eating and drinking, the prophet who had brought him back saddled his donkey for him. And so what the New International Version does is it takes that phrase, for the prophet whom he'd brought back, and says, no, that's not a reference to the man of God. It should be rendered the other way. And I think it should be, because it's found 3 times in this particular story. The Hebrew phrase, Hanabi Asur Hesabah, is used in verse 20. You see in verse 20, the prophet that brought him back, that's the old prophet. It's used again in verse 26, the prophet that brought him back, that's the old prophet. And it's the identical expression here in verse 23, the prophet that brought him back. So the suggestion is that the reading of the passage should be that when they'd finished eating and drinking, the prophet that brought him back, the old prophet, saddled for him, the man of God, the ass that he might ride away. So the old prophet sent the man of God away on an ass which he provided. Why do you think the old prophet gave the man of God an ass to ride upon? He hadn't come with one. Well, presumably because The old prophet felt such a sense of responsibility for the problems that he'd brought upon his guest that he gave him an ass to ride on because he wanted at least to make sure he got home safely. As a matter of incidence, I think it also means that throughout this whole story, the man of God is never called anything other than the man of God in this story. And that the phrase, the prophet whom he'd brought back, ought to be rendered the prophet that brought him back, as it's consistently rendered in verse 20 and verse 26. So when the meal was ended, the old prophet takes his ass, saddles it up, places the man of God on it, and sends him on his way. And when he was gone, says verse 24, when he was gone, a lion met him by the way. Now, in southern Palestine, lions were common. Bethel lies in the southern part of the country, and lions were very common in this region. We're told in Judges chapter 14 and verse 5 that there was a lion in Timnath that attacked Samson. We're told in 1 Samuel chapter 17 and verse 34 that there was a lion in Bethlehem that attacked David. We're told in the 2nd of Samuel chapter 23 and verse 20 that there was a lion in Kabzeel that attacked Benaiah. We're told in the 1st of Kings chapter 20 verse 36 that there was a lion in Aphek that attacked the prophet. Oh yes, lions were common in the area of southern Palestine in these days. In fact, they were so common. Come and have a look at this proverb in Proverbs chapter 26. Marvellous, really. It's about the ingenuity of the human brain. In Proverbs chapter 26, we have a little section in this chapter, runs from verses 13 to 16, and it's about the hopeless sluggard. That's what the whole of chapter 26 is about. It's how to discern between different characters. There's the useless fool and the hopeless sluggard and the meddling troublemaker and the hateful hypocrite. It's a whole series of chapters, a whole series of character analyses in Proverbs 26. But you notice what the slothful person says, verse 13. The slothful man says, there's a lion in the way. A lion is in the streets. And of course what the proverb meant was, well, I can't go to work today. There's a lion outside. And because lions were common, it just might possibly be true. So it was a very good excuse for people that were slothful to say, look, I'm sorry, I can't go to work today. I think there could be a lion lurking outside. And that little grain of truth made it plausible, you see. Every good reason why we shouldn't go to work. Now, let me tell you something interesting about the geography of Bethel with regard to lions. If you come to the 2nd of Kings chapter 2, we're told of a circumstance, a geographical circumstance that's of relevance to our story. 2nd of Kings chapter 2 and verse 23 says that he went up from thence unto Bethel. This is Elisha the prophet. As he was going up by the way, so this is the way that leads to Bethel, there came forth little children out of the city. So it must have been pretty close to Bethel, mustn't it, brothers and sisters? If the little children are playing nearby, it's just down the road a little bit, and they mocked him. They said, go up, thou bald man, go up, thou bald head. And he turned back and looked on them and cursed them in the name of Yahweh. And there came forth 2 she-bears out of the wood, and tare 40 and 2 children of them. But you notice that word wood. There was a wood, there was a forest near Bethel, right next to Bethel, that was large enough for bears to roam in. That's quite a wood, isn't it? Right next to Bethel. A wood for bears to roam in. But if you come to Jeremiah chapter 5, let me show you that same word for wood. Jeremiah chapter 5 uses the same word. It does mean a forest, by the way, a dense, thicketed forest. But in Jeremiah chapter 5 and verse 6 it says, wherefore a lion out of the wood, a lion out of the forest shall slay them. So you see, those thickets were the preferred habitat of lions. And it may well have been, therefore, that in this densely wooded forest right next to the city of Bethel, that if it was large enough and dense enough for bears to be roaming, there might well have been lions there as well. So can you imagine the thoughts of the man of God, brothers and sisters, as he travelled? He's already disturbed by the words of judgment. He's riding homewards. He's on the ass. He's still probably not far from Bethel. And of course, when a lion attacks, and particularly attacks out of the forest, they'll come from an angle that you cannot see them until it's too late. There would have been a sudden movement from behind, a sudden lunge, a sudden leap of the lion from beside the road, a death blow that killed the man of God instantly, and taken by surprise, he was left lifeless upon the road, as 1 Kings chapter 13 verse 24 tells us. It was all so very swift and so very sudden. He probably wouldn't have even seen it, brothers and sisters. It was all over before it had begun. He's riding down through that forest or past that forest, and a lion comes out. And with one swipe, that's all a lion needed, by the way, they were so incredibly powerful, one swipe and the man was dead, and actually, literally, by the force of that paw, was thrown off the ass and thrown dead to the ground. Now, given the presence of lions in the region, the possibility of a traveller being attacked by one was therefore very real, wasn't it? And if it occurred, it could have been seen as an accidental death. But what followed the attack, was so unusual, it could only be construed as miraculous. Because it wasn't just that a lion met him by the way near Bethel, because verse 24 goes on to say that not only did the lion slay him, but it says his carcass was cast in the way, and the ass stood by it. The lion also stood by the carcass. So there were three things that attested to the hand of God at the scene: the untouched carcass, the unmolested ass, and the unmovable lion. And all these fell outside the normal course of nature. And they testified to the world that the man of God did not die by chance. He died by the express and deliberate consequence of divine intervention. There was no other way to read the story of that scene upon the road, brothers and sisters, had we witnessed it, than to absolutely believe that God's hand must have been in this particular matter. It was remarkable, staggering. It's as if both animals remained standing there to guard the carcass. And their natural instincts were both held temporarily in check. The ass didn't flee and the lion didn't kill. There's something very, very strange, isn't there, about this scene? And people saw it, because verse 25 says, "And behold, men passed by and saw the carcass cast in the way, and the lion standing by the carcass, and they came and told it in the city where the old prophet dwelt." It was the most unusual sight of all, incidentally, was the lion standing over the carcass. Now, can you imagine these men coming around the corner? Oh, there's a lion in the street. There's a lion in the way. You would be interested in figuring out the nearest exit route, wouldn't you? But the strange thing is as they ducked off as quickly as they had come, they looked over their shoulder, and the lion stood stock still beside the carcass, didn't move an inch, wasn't interested in attacking them. It was sitting there unmovable. And then they saw, and the ass is there as well. What? So the record says, they came, verse 25, and they told it in the city where the old prophet dwelt. Oh, now, do you notice, brothers and sisters, they didn't tell the old prophet. Do you see that? It doesn't say that they told the old prophet, it says they told it in the city. So all Bethel came to hear the story of the lion and the ass and the carcass. And because all the city heard, no doubt King Jeroboam knew as well, but also he couldn't hush the matter. It was public knowledge. It had been blazed abroad. The death of the man of God and the story of his disobedience was now made public before all. So here, you see, was a challenge for Jeroboam, another opportunity for him to consider and to repent. if the man of God that had pronounced judgment against him, was he himself dead because of disobedience, then what would befall the king if he continued in his way? There was power to this story, wasn't there? And verse 26 says, "And when the prophet that brought him back from the way heard thereof." So do you notice that expression again, the prophet that brought him back? It's that same one, remember in verse 20, the prophet that brought him back. Verse 23, the prophet that brought him back, as we believe it should be rendered. And now verse 26, the prophet that brought him back. Except in verse 26, there's a little crucial addition, isn't there? The prophet that brought him back from the way. Brought him back from what way? And the answer is, brought him back from the way that God had asked the man of God to walk in. And you see, this was the terrible wrong that the old prophet had done. The book of Proverbs says, "Whoso causeth the righteous to go astray in an evil way, he shall fall himself into his own pit." Proverbs 28 verse 10. And so the old prophet is described here in the context of the wrong he did in urging the man of God to depart from that way. He was the one who'd caused a righteous man to go astray and walking in the way that he should never have gone, and that way was the way back to Bethel because of his invitation. And so when this news came into the city, brothers and sisters, that there's a dead body in the street just round the corner and there's a lion there, the old prophet knew immediately who it must be, didn't he? He just knew it, brothers and sisters. The moment he heard the news, he'd never forget that moment. There's a dead body just outside Bethel. "I know who the dead man is," came the reply. "It's the man of God," said the old prophet, and no doubt with tears in his eyes. There's a lesson here, brothers and sisters, how we wish that we might never be described as the one who caused another saint to walk in a way other than God's. We want to make sure that the impact we have upon others is only for their good and never for their spiritual detriment. I think the old prophet would never forget that moment when he heard that news, the news of a dead man, the carcass lying in the way. But even in that knowledge, God was at work in the life of the old prophet to bring about, we believe, a change for the good. You see how he describes him, verse 26? How does the old prophet describe the man of God? He says, "It is the man of God who was disobedient unto the word of Yahweh." But Rotherham says, "who rebelled against the bidding of Yahweh." And Green's literal says, "who provoked the mouth of Yahweh." And it's the same phrase as verse 21. When the old prophet had said, "Thou hast disobeyed the mouth of Yahweh," that's the same phrase here in verse 26. It's the man of God who was disobedient unto the mouth of Yahweh. It's a reference to that direct verbal command first given to the man of God. And so the old prophet says in verse 26, "Therefore Yahweh hath delivered him unto the lion which hath torn him and slain him." Incidentally, I think the margin is better and more correct. When the margin says that the lion has broken him, I think that's a better translation and a better idea than torn, because the body wasn't torn to pieces. We know that, brothers and sisters, because verse 28 says, at the end of the verse, "The lion had not eaten the carcass, nor torn the ass." So the body was lying there, but it hadn't been torn to pieces by the lion. The man of God had been killed, but he hadn't been torn to pieces. And that broken word, I think, is absolutely correct, because So powerful is the lion's paw that one single blow can break a man's neck instantly. So the man was dead, but the lion's actually still there guarding the body. It's not eating it. And the ass is alongside. But perhaps the critical word in verse 26, brothers and sisters, is the word therefore. It's the man of God who was disobedient. Therefore, the Lord hath delivered him. You see, there's another divine principle at work here, and it's axiomatic to God's dealings with us. It always has been. It's called the law of consequences, and it was instigated in the Garden of Eden. Now, do you remember what it says? You see, the man of God here was disobedient to the mouth of God, and he suffered the divine judgment of the lion, into whose power he was delivered. He died as a consequence because the law of consequence was at work in his life. Now, here's the idea from Genesis. You see, Genesis chapter 2, verses 16 and 17 brings two laws side by side that God operates through in all his dealings with mankind. Of every tree of the garden thou mayest freely eat, the law of free will. But there is one tree which you mustn't eat, and in the day thou eatest thereof thou shalt surely die, the law of consequences. And these, in the genius of God, brothers and sisters, he's brought these two principles into all his dealings with mankind. He insists that we be given free will, does he not, brothers and sisters? It's the law of God that we must act on the basis of our free will. God will never take our free will away from us. He leaves us free to choose, precisely because he wants us to choose. But side by side with the law of free will comes the law of consequences. You know, when we're young, we imagine that the law of free will gives us delightful liberty and license to pursue whatever we would like in life. It's only when the law of consequences turns out to be so unbelievably painful that we realize that maybe the law of free will wasn't quite as wide as we thought. That even in exercising free will, we've got to be careful about our choices because there are consequences. And so what God says is, he says the law of free will, you're free to choose. But the law of consequences says you're not free to escape the consequences of whatever you choose to do. You must pay the price. Isn't that why Paul says in Galatians and chapter 6, verse 7, see those two ideas? Whatsoever a man sows, law of free will. Yes, but that also shall he reap, law of consequences. You ever thought about why Paul says, be not deceived, brothers and sisters? It's because we do deceive ourselves. We pretend that we can do things and not face consequences. Or we pretend that we can do things and that there won't be consequences. Or that somehow we will avoid the consequences. And we can't, brothers and sisters. It's the law of harvest. You sow, you reap. It's inescapable. We spend the rest of our lives trying to understand how the law of free will and the law of consequences are at play in our lives, but it is a divine principle. And the man of God suffered the law of consequences, but he exercised the law of free will to choose. And so do we all, brothers and sisters. But we must never forget that side by side with the doctrine of free will is the doctrine of consequence. It's how God keeps us in balance in terms of how we might seek him, to follow after him in all our ways. So the old prophet says at the end of verse 26, he says it's the man of God who was disobedient. Therefore Yahweh hath delivered him unto the lion, which hath torn him and slain him, according to the word of Yahweh, which he spake unto him. Now that's interesting, because actually it wasn't Yahweh directly that spake the word unto the man of God, was it? Who was it? It was the old prophet himself, verses 21 and 22. But he rightly describes the word of Yahweh, which God had spoken effectively to the man of God. In other words, the old prophet realized that he was but the instrument of God's message. He wasn't the author of it. He was simply God's spokesman, but it was God's message to the man of God. And I think that as he says that, and the way in which he says that we've got a sign that the old prophet has got God back at the centre of his mind again, God back at the forefront of his thinking. This was all of God, he says, not of me, even though I spoke the words. It was God's message. And I realise that now, says the old prophet. And I realise the force of God's message and perhaps the implications of it. Well, what would the city make then, brothers and sisters, of this astonishing news that the man of God was dead? What would the king do in response to this evidence of divine judgment? And how would the old prophet take up that enormity of what he'd done as the full realization of his own sin came so powerfully upon him? Well, that, brothers and sisters, is the subject of our study tomorrow.